September 18, 1970. Jimi Hendrix is found unresponsive in a London flat. In our world, the next chapter of his story was lost, his guitar silenced, his voice missing from every protest that followed. But what if he didn't die that morning? What if the ambulance came in time and Hendrix lived? He doesn't just keep playing. He kills disco, reinvents protest music, and one night he shows up at a Bronx block party that births hip-hop. This is the timeline where Hendrix survived, and the world never danced the same. After exhausting world tours and setting guitars ablaze, his spark nearly burned out. By 1972, the Jimi Hendrix the world knew was gone. The survivor was quieter, wary of his own legend. He drifted through New York, shadowed by the weight of expectation promoters waving stadium contracts. Fans hungry for another spectacle, the industry desperate to keep him frozen in the wild colors of the late 60s. But Hendrix was restless. He wasn't interested in reliving the past. He wanted a new language, a way forward. He found it not on the world's biggest stages, but in the dim, smoky jazz clubs of downtown Manhattan. Miles Davis was there, too deep into his Bitches Brew era, reworking jazz with electric guitars and studio experimentation, tearing music apart to rebuild it from the ground up. In our world, their meeting was a rumor, a session that never happened. Here, with Hendrix alive and searching, the collaboration became inevitable. They holed up in Electric Lady Studios, not as icons, but as explorers. Miles's horn cut through the haze, a sharp counterpoint to Jimmy's spiraling guitar. The sessions were long, sometimes brutal. They argued, they laughed, they played until the sun came up. They were inventing something, chasing a sound that had no name yet. Meanwhile, in the basements and back rooms of Philadelphia and New York, another movement was taking shape. A crafted for dance floor escapism beat, polished and predictable, began to pulse through the clubs. Disco was rising, promising a way to forget, to slip into the glitter and lose yourself for a few hours. It was smooth, it was safe, and it was about to go mainstream. But just as disco's first big wave began to crest, Hendrix and Davis released their record. There was no press tour, no preamble. The album was called Electric Church Funk. It was sprawling, politically charged, and impossible to ignore psychedelic guitar lines tangled with dissonant horns, rhythms that refused to settle down. It wasn't music for the dance floor. It was music that demanded attention, that made you sit still and listen. The album did more than sell. It split the culture wide open. Songs stretched past 10 minutes, pulling listeners through stories of social decay and spiritual rebirth. It was the opposite of disco's glittering surface, a direct challenge, raw and unfiltered. People argued about it in record shops, wrote essays about it for college radio, fought about it in the pages of Rolling Stone. For a moment, the conversation wasn't about the next dance craze. It was about what music could be. Labels pivoted hard toward gritty funk rock outfits, starving disco of the marketing muscle it needed to go mainstream. Suddenly, A&R reps weren't looking for the next Bee Gees. They were combing Detroit, Chicago, and Oakland for bands that sounded like Electric Church Funk. Musicians who, in our world, might have been overlooked found themselves with major deals. The industry's machine shifted, and disco, without its corporate oxygen, stayed a vibrant but contained subculture. Studio 54 glittered in its own corner, but the real noise was coming out of Electric Lady Studios. By the late 70s, the rhythm of the decade had changed. The backbone wasn't a simple four-on-the-floor beat, but the unpredictable, syncopated groove of funk music built on improvisation, rebellion, and the sense that anything could happen. The soundtrack of a generation was raw, more complicated, and impossible to ignore, all because Hendrix refused to become his own tribute act. Instead, he chose the harder path: collaboration, reinvention, risk. In doing so, he didn't just sideline disco. He rewrote what the mainstream could sound like. The aftershocks of those sessions reached far beyond the studio walls, into places no one expected. And in the city's neglected boroughs, another revolution was brewing, one that would take the fragments of Hendrix's new sound and build something entirely its own. While our DJs prize the 2-second funky drummer loop, Here they discovered Hendrix's 6-minute psychedelic jam. The Bronx in the late 1970s was a city of fragments, broken glass, broken budgets, broken promises. But on weekends, the city's pulse changed. In echoing gymnasiums and on cracked basketball courts, DJs pieced together a new language from scavenged records. In our world, the breakbeat was a tight, relentless loop, a foundation for MCs to build on. In this timeline, the crates held something stranger, the sprawling, unpredictable grooves Hendrix had cut in the early and mid-70s. These weren't just beats, they were living, breathing soundscapes. By 1981, Joseph Sadler Grandmaster Flash got his hands on a battered copy of Electric Church Funk. He dropped the needle and found a drum break that was heavier, looser, and threaded with guitar lines that didn't just keep time, but carved out a strange kind of melody. The loop wasn't a static backdrop. It was a shifting world, a place for MCs to wander and get lost. DJs circled these grooves, not for their predictability, but for the possibilities they opened up. The parties changed. The crowd listened differently. The break wasn't just the part you danced to. It was the part you remembered. Word traveled. Hendrix, now in his 40s and mostly out of the spotlight, started hearing about these new block parties where his music was being torn apart and rebuilt. Rather than sue, Hendrix chose curiosity. Showing up at a Bronx block party, tape recorder in hand, he stood in the back, watching as his riffs and rhythms were cut up, looped, and scratched into something unrecognizable but undeniably his. What would Hendrix do when he heard his own riffs reimagined on city streets? He didn't take the mic. He didn't demand the stage. Instead, he listened. He saw DJs using his records like raw material, building something that felt as urgent and experimental as anything he'd ever tried in the studio. He saw MCs, some barely out of high school, spinning stories over his grooves with a rawness he hadn't heard since the old bluesmen of his childhood. It wasn't nostalgia. It was evolution. Hendrix didn't try to reclaim the spotlight. He became a quiet architect, a bridge between the underground and the world class. He opened Electric Lady Studios to the kids from the Bronx, offering them not just a place to record, but the tools to experiment. Africa Bambaataa brought his electro-funk, running it through Hendrix's arsenal of effects. Curtis Blow's City Tales gained new weight as Hendrix layered in sparse, haunting guitar lines. The studio became a laboratory. Tape machines running late into the night, beats and rhymes stitched together with the kind of technical wizardry only Hendrix could provide. The impact was immediate. Hip-hop, which in our world was dismissed as novelty or party music, arrived as protest. Every track a dispatch from the front lines. Scholars later noted hip-hop's roots in social commentary, now turbocharged by Hendrix's blues DNA. Imagine Grandmaster, Flash and the Furious Fives, The Message. In our world, it rides a cold, synthetic bass line. Here, it's built on a live, mournful blues riff, Hendrix's guitar weaving in and out of Mel Mel's verses. The song becomes more than a report from the streets. It's a living blues epic, as much about survival as rebellion. With Hendrix as collaborator, mentor, and champion, hip-hop's golden age started earlier and sounded different. The music was dense, experimental, and emotional. Machine rhythm fused with human soul. Early hits weren't just about boasting or dancing. They were layered, complex, and impossible to ignore. Hendrix's presence didn't just legitimize the movement. It forced the world to listen. By the early 1980s, the mainstream couldn't keep up. Hip-hop was no longer an underground experiment or a passing trend. It was a force one that bent the industry toward it. But as the decade turned, a center of gravity in popular music shifted again. A new kind of virtuoso was about to step into the light, and the airwaves were about to become a battlefield. In 1984, the airwaves became a proving ground for something unprecedented. Prince Rogers Nelson, stepping out from Minneapolis with Purple Rain, was more than a new star. He was a musical anomaly. At the same time, Prince's Purple Rain era shattered genre walls with synth-driven funk and emotive vocals. He played every instrument, wrote every lyric, and blurred every line between rock, soul, and pop. The world watched as he redefined what a pop icon could be. But in this timeline, the shadow he was measured against wasn't a memory. Jimi Hendrix, no longer a ghost, stood at the edge of middle age, still restless, still reinventing the language of the guitar. The conversation wasn't about legacy, it was about supremacy, and it was happening live, every week, on radios across the country. Neither man reached for mentorship. What followed was a rivalry that made headlines and rewrote the rules. They traded chart positions like musical gauntlets, each single daring radio DJs to pick a side. When Prince unleashed the stark, bassless groove of When Doves Cry, Hendrix answered with a single that pulsed around a hypnotic bass riff and a guitar line as haunted as it was modern. Prince responded with layered, studio-perfect masterpieces. Hendrix countered with tracks that sounded live, almost unpolished, but cut deeper than anything else on the dial. It wasn't animosity. It was an arms race of mutual respect, each artist pushing the other, and the industry into places no one else dared. Back then, rock stations rarely aired R&B, and pop stations avoided raw blues riffs. Radio lived and died by format. But Prince and Hendrix didn't fit. Was Let's Go Crazy rock or funk? Was Hendrix's latest a blues track, or something closer to hip-hop? Their refusal to stay in their lanes forced radio programmers into crisis mode. The industry's boundaries blurred not because of a marketing trend, but because these two refused to be boxed in. Program directors, desperate to keep up, invented new hybrid categories just to accommodate their sound. Suddenly, artists who would have been locked out of the mainstream found themselves with a shot. The decade's soundscape fractured, then reformed, wider and stranger than before. Then came Live Aid, the world's biggest stage, and a secret guest that stunned billions. July 13th, 1985. Broadcast from Philadelphia to every corner of the globe. The organizers wanted Hendrix for nostalgia, a victory lap through the hits of the 60s. Hendrix agreed, but only if he could choose a guest, kept secret until the moment of truth. Midway through a fierce, reimagined Voodoo Child, Hendrix stopped cold. He leaned into the microphone, and in a voice heard by the world said, "Prince." What followed wasn't a duet. It was a confrontation. Prince strode out in a flash of purple, guitar in hand, and met Hendrix at center stage. What happened next lasted 15 minutes, but changed the course of music history. They didn't share the spotlight, they fought for it, note by note. Prince played with surgical precision, every lick a challenge. Hendrix answered with a storm of feedback and blues, each phrase threatening to break apart, but always snapping back into place. The crowd barely breathed. This was no tribute. It was a collision past and future, control and chaos, two visions of what music could be. In that moment, pre-programmed pop felt like a museum piece compared to the live electricity crackling between two legends. The duel eclipsed every other act that day. No one talked about nostalgia afterward. They talked about what was possible. The performance wasn't just a highlight, it was a warning shot. The rest of the decade's synth-pop suddenly felt safe, almost sterile. This was proof that the most vital music was raw, unpredictable, and forged in the heat of real-time rivalry. After Live Aid, nothing sounded the same. The industry scrambled to catch up. Musicians who'd been told to pick a lane now found the borders erased. The public, once content with nostalgia, demanded something new, something alive. But every seismic shift leaves an aftershock. The world had watched two living legends reshape the present. Soon, the conversation would turn to what it meant to see your heroes endure, to see the myth replaced by something more complicated and more human. The echo of a different song lingers when the myth never takes hold. With Hendrix alive, the 27 Club fades to a footnote, not a legend. Decades later, a British medical journal study showed no statistical spike at 27, proving the myth lives in memory, not math. The story of rock shifts from tragic endings to the ongoing challenge of reinvention and mastery. No longer a martyr icon, but a living architect of music's future. His continued journey doesn't just add albums. It rewires the very language of what we hear. Imagine your favorite guitar solo rewritten by Hendrix's survival. Let us know which song you'd want him to revisit in the comments. Imagine your favorite guitar solo rewritten by Hendrix's survival. Let us know which song you'd want him to revisit in the comments.